He married her by force, not out of love, out of a line buried deep in a will, written by a woman long gone, who somehow knew both their wounds better than they did. The wedding took 7 minutes. No vows, no smiles, just 2 signatures and a silence so heavy it could break glass. Outside, the sea hit the rocks like a warning. Inside, they couldn't even meet each other's eyes. But that night in the house, built on someone else's promise, one quiet touch changed everything. It didn't spark romance. It sparked recognition, because sometimes the people we're forced to live with are the ones who finally teach us how to live it all. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe now. Let's begin. The paper trembled in Mason Hale's hand, though the wind inside the lawyer's office was perfectly still. Outside, the Atlantic roared against the cliffs, scattering sea spray that found its way even through the cracks in the old window frame. He'd spent years designing houses that defied storms, but no blueprint had ever prepared him for this, his own name written beside a woman's he barely knew, bound together by a dead woman's wish. Evelyn Voss's signature glimmered in blue ink at the bottom of the will. Mason read the line again, slower this time, hoping the words might rearrange themselves to preserve the Hale Light property and its library fund. My goddaughter, Claire Whitmore, and my protege. Mason Hale must marry within 10 days of my passing and cohabit the estate for 6 months. He exhaled, the sound harsh against the hush of the room. This has to be a joke, he muttered. Across the oak table, the lawyer, an old man with lenses fogged by salt air, didn't flinch. Miss Voss was clear. Without this arrangement, the property reverts to the state. The children's reading endowment dissolves. The phrase children's reading endowment floated between them like something fragile. Evelyn had poured half her fortune into that small lighthouse library for the fishermen's kids. Without it, winter in Seabright would swallow more than stories. It would swallow hope. Mason pinched the bridge of his nose. She wanted a museum, not a marriage certificate. A chair scraped softly. He looked up. Claire Whitmore stood near the window, coat still damp from the drizzle. He'd met her only twice at Evelyn's gatherings, once at a summer picnic, once at the funeral 3 days ago. She was younger than he remembered, maybe late 30s, her hair the color of wheat in rain. She didn't look shocked, only tired, like someone who had already accepted the world's unfair bargains. If this house keeps children warm, she said quietly, I'll stand in any storm. Her voice was low, steady, but it carried something that pinned him where he sat. For a moment, he saw Evelyn's old smile in her gentle, stubborn, impossible to argue with. The lawyer cleared his throat. You both have 10 days to comply. Otherwise, I know. Mason interrupted. He rose, tall enough that the office felt smaller. We'll sign the intent tomorrow. But this isn't a wedding. It's a contract. Claire met his gaze. You can call it whatever helps you sleep. He almost admired the edge in her tone. Almost. Outside, the wind caught the door as he opened it, yanking it wide. Salt stung his face. He pulled his collar high and strode toward his truck, parked beneath the gray canopy of pines. The sky had that heavy look coastal people recognized, rain thickening behind the clouds. He tried not to picture her expression, that calm acceptance that made him feel like the selfish one. Halfway down the drive, he stopped. The cliff road curved east, revealing the faint outline of the lighthouse, his old project, Evelyn's obsession, the town's heart. It stood hollow now, its lantern dark since her passing. The idea of someone else living there, moving through those rooms filled with the memory of his late wife's laughter, felt unbearable, yet the thought of the state auctioning it to Mallory developers felt worse. He started the engine. Claire's small cottage smelled of chamomile tea and dusted paper. She sat at her mother's piano, not playing, only tracing the ivory keys. The lawyer's words echoed in her mind. She'd expected legal confusion after Evelyn's death. Not this marriage. To Mason Hale, the man whose name still appeared in architecture journals she used to read in college libraries. The man who hadn't attended Evelyn's memorial reception, too proud or too broken to face anyone. Her phone buzzed. A message from the lawyer's assistant meeting tomorrow. Ought to sign preliminary documents. She stared at it, thumb hovering, before locking the screen again. Her mother's voice, faint from the next room, called, "You've been quiet, sweetheart." "Just thinking," Claire replied. "About him." She hesitated. "About Evelyn." The old woman chuckled softly. "Evelyn never did anything without a reason. Maybe she thought you two could fix each other, or ruin each other." The laughter turned into a cough. Claire rose, fetched water, and waited until her mother's breathing steadied. When she sat again, she looked at her hands' ink stains from writing grant proposals, the small scar near her thumb from the time she tried to rescue a stray cat. These were ordinary hands, unfit for legal bindings and strange promises, yet somewhere deep inside, under the fatigue and fear, a flicker of something stirred. What if the house really could become a refuge again? She exhaled. "All right, Evelyn," she murmured into the room's dimness. "I'll try." The next morning dawned in mist thick as milk. Mason arrived early at the county office, tie crooked, coffee untouched. Claire came 10 minutes later, hair damp again from the drizzle. They sat side by side while the clerk read clauses about timelines, cohabitation, annulment rights. The language was cold, but underneath it pulsed a strange intimacy, 2 signatures that would change every morning for 6 months. "Any questions?" the clerk asked. Mason's pen paused above the line. "Yes. Can we make amendments within reason?" He scribbled notes, each one a wall, separate rooms. Financial independence. Clear exit date. When he passed the paper across, Claire studied it, lips curving slightly. Then she added 3 short lines of her own beneath his list before signing. When she handed the document back, Mason's eyes flicked down. The ink read, "No cruelty. No lying. Eat at the same table." Their gazes met, the kind that lasts half a heartbeat too long. The clerk's stapler clicked, sealing the agreement. Outside, the wind picked up again, scattering loose papers from the bin. One page skittered across the sidewalk and caught at Claire's shoe. She bent to pick it up, the copy of the property deed, and for a second their hands brushed against the same corner. The contact jolted them both like static. Mason straightened first. "I'll bring the keys tomorrow," he said. She nodded. "I'll bring coffee." Houses wake easier with coffee. The line startled him with its warmth. He almost smiled but didn't. As she walked away through the fog, her figure blurred into the pale distance, and, for reasons he couldn't name, he whispered into the wind, "What kind of storm are you?" "Miss Whitmore." The sea answered with a crash against the rocks below, as if promising that he would find out soon enough. The road to Hale Light twisted through pine and fog, the kind of road that made the world feel like it was folding in on itself. Claire drove slowly, her mother's borrowed sedan wheezing as it climbed the final hill. The lighthouse appeared through the mist, pale against the slate-gray sky, its glass dome clouded with salt, its railing rusted to the color of dried blood. For a moment, she felt like she was driving straight into someone else's memory. Mason's truck was already parked beside the porch, tailgate down, boxes stacked in precise rows. He was kneeling by the front steps, fixing a loose board with deliberate strikes of his hammer. Each blow echoed through the empty yard like punctuation marks in an argument she hadn't joined yet. She turned off the engine. "Morning," she called softly. He didn't look up. "You're late. It's 8:50. Workday starts at 8. Claire smiled, faint but steady. "Good thing this isn't a job." He stood then, wiping his hands on a rag, and pushed open the front door. "You'll want the room upstairs facing east. It gets the first light. You're taking the west. I prefer the dark," he said. The air inside smelled of cedar and old paint, with something sweeter underneath lavender, maybe, faded but lingering, the kind of scent that once belonged to someone. The entry hall was narrow, its walls lined with photographs, children holding lanterns, Evelyn Voss smiling beside the town's fishermen, and in the center, a framed picture of Mason and a woman with sunlight hair standing on the lighthouse balcony. The plaque beneath read, "Rebecca Hale, 1979-2015. Claire's steps slowed. She didn't need to ask. The walls already told her everything. Mason noticed her pause. "That room's off limits," he said quietly. "Everything in it stays as it is. I wasn't planning to change anything." He gave a curt nod and walked ahead. The house creaked as they moved through it, planks expanding with the cold, pipes moaning in their rust. Claire trailed her fingers along the banister, feeling the uneven varnish. "Feels alive," she murmured. "It's old wood," he replied. Old wood doesn't like strangers. I don't blame it. When she reached the second floor, she stopped by a brass hook near the stairwell. Hanging from it was a coat navy wool, the buttons dulled, a faint perfume still clinging to the collar. It swayed lightly in the draft like someone invisible had just hung it there. Mason froze halfway up the stairs when he saw her looking. His jaw tightened. "Leave that." It stays." Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, she wanted to argue, to ask why anyone would trap themselves with ghosts. But the grief in his face wasn't something to fight. Without another word, she stepped aside and continued down the hall. Later, when he was outside unloading boxes, she returned. She took the coat gently from the hook, folded it into a cedar chest by the window, and closed the lid. No words, no explanation, just quiet respect. By afternoon, the temperature dropped fast. The news said 38 degrees and falling, the kind of Maine chill that seeped through floors and skin alike. Mason lit the stove in the kitchen while Claire unpacked her small collection of books. Their movements were careful, like two people trying not to disturb an invisible third presence. When she opened the cupboard, she found mismatched china stacked in neat piles, each cup turned upside down. "Evelyn must have been half librarian, half artist," she said, touching the delicate rim of a teacup painted with wild roses. Mason glanced over his shoulder. "That was Rebecca's set." She stopped. "Sorry, I didn't—" "It's fine," he said too quickly, voice thin. "They can be used. That's what they're for." But she noticed his hands tighten around the matchbox until the cardboard bent. Outside, wind scraped across the windows, making the glass hum. The lighthouse above groaned as if remembering its own age. They ate in near-silent soup Claire had brought in a thermos. Bread Mason had baked himself. 2 bowls, 2 spoons, the quiet rhythm of clinking metal. When the first snow began to fall, power flickered. The lights dimmed, flared, then went black. Mason cursed under his breath, heading to the utility closet. Claire grabbed her coat. "I'll find candles. Lanterns in the hallway," he called back. She moved by touch, guided by the faint glow from the fireplace. The air felt colder already, the kind of chill that found its way between heartbeats. Her fingers brushed against a shelf metal, cold, then a lantern handle. She lifted it just as Mason reached for the same one. Their hands collided. For a fraction of a second, skin met skin, his hand rough, hers chilled, and both froze. The silence was sharp enough to cut. Then Mason pulled back, as if he'd touched a live wire. "I'll get another," he said hoarsely. Claire didn't move. "You don't have to. I said I'll get another." He disappeared into the dark, footsteps echoing up the stairs. The old house settled again, sighing through the beams. Claire lit the lantern with a match, the small flame blooming like a heartbeat. Warm light spilled across the hallway, painting the peeling wallpaper gold. She stood there a long time, listening to the wind press against the glass, thinking how strange it was that 2 people could share the same roof and still feel miles apart. Upstairs, she heard a door close softly the west room, his retreat. She imagined him sitting on the edge of the bed, rubbing his hands together to chase off the chill. Maybe he was thinking of his wife, or maybe of the woman downstairs who'd folded a stranger's coat and refused to leave it hanging like a ghost. The lantern flickered, dimmed, then steadied again. Claire exhaled and whispered into the quiet, not sure who she was speaking to, the house, the wind, or the man she couldn't yet understand. "Old wood doesn't like strangers," she said softly. "But maybe it remembers kindness." The flame wavered, as if answering her, and somewhere in the distance the sea struck the cliffs with a long, rolling sigh. The note went up on the fridge just after sunrise, taped at all four corners like a warning label. Mason's handwriting was clean, architect steady, numbers aligned down the left margin. 1. Quiet hours, 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. 2. No visitors without notice. 3. Curfew door locked by 9:30. 4. West room off limits. 5. Workshop ask before entering. 6. Mail and keys separate trays. 7. Groceries itemized receipts split weekly. 8. Chores alternating days, list posted. 9. Lighthouse catwalk no access during storms. 10. No photographs moved. 11. Emergencies call first, don't shout. 12. No touching personal rooms or belongings. The house was quiet enough to hear the tape crackle, the paper settle. Claire stood with a mug warming her hands. Steam drifted into the cold kitchen light. She read the list once, then again, eyes moving more slowly over the last line. No touching personal rooms or belongings. She repeated, almost to the kettle. Got it. Mason opened a drawer, found magnets shaped like little lighthouse lanterns, and pinned the paper harder than necessary. Click, click. The sound felt bigger than it was. He turned to the sink. Dishes 2 bowls from the night before sat drying in a metal rack. He aligned them without looking, as if order could keep the day from shifting. We'll be less likely to get in each other's way, he said. Less likely, Claire echoed. Her voice had that soft humor people used with skittish horses. He dried his hands and reached for the door. On the way out, he paused. The hardware store closes at 5. If you need anything for your room. Light bulbs. Maybe, she said. Evelyn used warm ones. He nodded once and left, boots thudding across the porch. The door shut gently, no slam, just a small wooden click. Claire looked at the paper one more time. Then she found a fresh sheet, squared it under her palm, and wrote 3 lines. A no cruelty. B no lying. C eat at the same table. She added a tiny dot after the last letter. Then she slid her sheet beneath his and used 2 mismatched magnets, one shaped like a blueberry, one like a starfish. The magnets made a softer sound. Tap, tap. When Mason came back at noon, sleeves dusted with sawdust, a bruise of cold on his cheeks, he found her note. He didn't touch it. He stood there long enough for the kettle to resume its faint metallic ticking. Eat at the same table. He read, That one seems fair, she said, spooning tuna into a bowl for a gray cat that did not belong to either of them and yet clearly owned the porch. Storms don't care who you are, but tables do. He huffed something like a laugh and gave up on hiding it. What if I'm working late? Then I'll keep your place warm. That isn't necessary. Maybe not, she said, rinsing the spoon. But it's kind. The word landed in the room like a pebble in a deep well. Kind. He hadn't heard it about anything he'd done in a long time. He placed a sack of nails on the counter with careful precision. Curfew still stands. Mine do too. He raised an eyebrow. Yours no cruelty. No lying. She lifted the 3rd finger. Eat at the same table. He gave the smallest nod, as if the court had reached a verdict. We'll try. They did. All afternoon, they moved around each other like planets that hadn't learned their orbits. Claire rearranged her east room. No photos moved, no drawers opened, just clean sheets and warm bulbs, the kind Evelyn liked. Mason mended the loose clapboard along the north side, the hammer tapping a heartbeat into the wind. When he passed the kitchen window, he saw her reading on a stool, feet tucked under, lips shaping silent words. The picture tugged at something sore and sweet in him. As evening fell, the temperature slipped toward 38 again. He felt it in his bones the way some men feel rain the house tightening, the air gaining teeth. He washed up, scrubbed beneath his nails, and came back to the kitchen where a pot waited on low heat. I made stew, Claire said, as if it were no more remarkable than breathing. Carrots, pearl onions, a touch of thyme. That was not required, he said. Kind, she answered, unbothered. Not required. He reached for a bowl and stopped. Habit dragged him to the far counter, the place he'd eaten standing. Nights he couldn't bear the weight of a chair and a memory at once. His hand hovered over the drawer for a spoon. Behind him, a simple sound, the legs of a wooden chair scuffing softly across the floor. She slid it to the table, set a napkin, a spoon, and a slice of bread on a small plate. Then she didn't look at him. She just tapped the chair's back with 2 fingers, a light little rhythm. Tap, tap. The room held its breath. Mason stayed where he was, spine locked. He heard gulls outside, the stove's low hum, his own pulse. The chair waited with the patience of an old friend. "I can eat," he began. "Standing." She finished gently. "I know." He studied the knot in the pine tabletop, the way it spun like a small galaxy. He had designed conference tables that cost more than a lobster boat. He had not sat at this one since before Rebecca died. The thought tasted like salt. Claire didn't push again. She buttered her own bread. The knife made a soft whisper against the crust. She ladled Stu his bowl first, then hers, and set the pot back on the trivet with a careful clink. Small sounds, large meanings. He took a breath, one then another, and crossed the room. The chair did not move. He pulled it back. The legs against wood said stay. He sat. For a second his body forgot how to. Then the world found its place. The table under his palms. The heat rising from the bowl. The smell of time meeting winter air. Across from him, Claire lowered her head and said nothing grand, no speech about healing, no platitude about time. Just a quiet. "It's hot." He nodded. "I see that." They ate, spoon against bowl, bread torn shared. Outside, the lighthouse let out a long, tired groan, the metal cooling, the wind testing the seams. He felt the house notice him, the way an animal notices a hand it no longer fears. The feeling was so delicate, he almost didn't recognize it. Midway through, he caught himself about to stand. She didn't look up. She just slid the small salt cellar toward him with the back of her fingers. He stayed seated. After, he reached for the dishes out of instinct, but she shook her head. "Chores list says it's my day." "I thought you didn't like lists," he said. "I like honest ones," she answered, stacking bowls. "Yours will be wrong sometimes. Mine will too. We'll fix them." He rinsed his glass, placed it upside down in the rack. The kitchen window showed only their reflections, doubled in the dark. 2 people at a table. Nothing about it would make the news, yet it felt like a headline inside his chest. At the fridge, the 2 papers waited side by side, neat as neighbors. He moved one magnet a hair's breadth higher, as if balance mattered there, as if it might hold. Claire dried her hands. "Tomorrow I'll bring cinnamon for the coffee. Houses wake easier with cinnamon." He almost said thank you. The word was on his tongue, new and too bright. Instead, he said, "Curfew is in 10 minutes." She smiled a little. "Then we should let the house sleep." He turned off the kitchen light. In the brief dark before the hall lamp came on, he heard another sound, small, contented, almost like a sigh. Maybe it was the stove settling, maybe the old wood, or maybe something in him, lowering itself into a chair at last. And in that soft, almost nothing, he wondered what else might sit down, if asked kindly enough. Seabright was a town that never blinked. The ocean might turn its back twice a day, but the people never did. By the end of their first week at Hale Light, everyone from the postmaster to the woman who baked blueberry scones at the Pier Cafe had an opinion about Mason Hale's arrangement. Claire felt it every time she stepped into town, the hush that followed. The curious smiles that weren't smiles at all. Even the gulls seemed to circle lower, as if gossip had wings. That morning, the fog had lifted early, revealing streets wet with last night's rain. She parked outside the Lantern Diner, where the coffee was strong enough to wake the harbor and the windows always steamed. Mason had gone to the lumber yard, so she came alone, craving warmth that didn't depend on the house's drafty walls. Inside, a small brass bell jingled as she entered. Heads turned subtle, but all at once, Mrs. Henley, the owner, wiped her hands on her apron. "Well now, Mrs. "Hale," she said with a practiced sweetness. Claire blinked. "Just Claire, please." "Of course," the woman said, but the smile never changed. Claire ordered coffee, black, and found a corner booth. The mug arrived with a tiny chip near the rim like everything else in town. A little broken, a little proud of it. She had just taken her second sip when a man's reflection appeared in the window beside her. Expensive coat, clean shoes, a face too smooth for this weather. "Grant Mallory," he said, offering a practiced grin as he slid into the opposite seat without asking. "You must be the new tenant at Hale Light." Claire set the mug down. "We're not tenants." He smiled as if she'd confirmed something. "Right. The paper said Evelyn left a few conditions." His voice was soft, the kind people mistake for charm until it cuts. Claire recognized him from the town meeting. Evelyn once hosted the developer who'd offered to buy the lighthouse land, turn it into a coastal wellness retreat. Evelyn had refused him outright. "What do you want, Mr. Mallory?" she asked. He leaned back, casual. "To make you an offer, one that's better than 6 months in a drafty old tomb." She said nothing. The diner's hum filled the silence plates clinking, the hiss of eggs on the grill. He continued, lowering his voice. "The property's bleeding value. My company could restore it, repurpose it. Evelyn's endowment could live on through us. I'd need someone cooperative to sign off when the board reviews the sale next month." Claire stared at him. "You mean me? You and Mr. Hale?" But between us, he smiled again. Thin as a blade, I doubt he's sentimental enough to stay married to a stranger for long. And if things end sooner than expected, the paperwork gets easier. There it was, a bribe wrapped in politeness. She felt the old heat of anger rise in her chest, the kind that had once cost her jobs, friends, sleep. "What exactly are you offering?" "Mr. Mallory," she said, each word careful, measured. "A consulting role," he said smoothly. "Advisory. Discreet. I imagine a woman like you could use financial stability." Her hands tightened around the coffee mug. "You imagine wrong." The air between them thickened. Mallory's smile faltered just enough to show the teeth behind it. "You'll want to think carefully before you tie yourself to Hale. Men like him, they only know how to build walls. And I'm offering you a door." Claire rose, dropped a few dollars on the table for the coffee. "I've had enough doors slammed in my face to know the difference between one that opens and one that leads to a fall." She stepped into the cold, her breath ghosting in front of her. The wind smelled like salt and steel. She walked toward her car, trying to shake the feeling that her skin had been touched by something oily. Across the street, near the hardware store, Mason was loading lumber into his truck. He hadn't meant to stop there. He'd seen her through the diner window by chance. He'd also seen Mallory lean in, his smile too close, his hand briefly touching the table between them. Now, as she crossed the street, Mason's shoulders tensed. "Who was that?" he asked before she even reached him. "Grant Mallory," she said simply. "What did he want?" "Nothing that matters." "Claire." His voice sharpened. "I know his reputation. Developers like him don't waste time unless they're buying something or someone." She looked up at him, calm. "Do you really think I'd sell Evelyn's house to a man like that?" Mason hesitated, and that small pause was enough. The cold cut straight through the space between them. "I didn't say you would," he said quietly. "But you thought it." The lumber creaked under his hand. "I saw him lean in. You didn't look like you wanted to leave." Her jaw tightened, because sometimes walking away takes longer than standing up. They stared at each other, the sound of gulls overhead filling the silence where trust should have been. He dropped the tailgate hard, the echo clattering down the empty street. "Next time," he said, "tell me before the whole town starts whispering." Claire stepped back, her voice steady. "Next time. Believe me before it does." She turned, heading for her car. The wind caught her hair, flinging it across her face, but she didn't stop. The driver's door shut with a muted thud. Mason watched as she pulled onto the road, tires spitting gravel, taillights fading into the mist. Inside the diner, Grant Mallory watched too, stirring sugar into a new cup of coffee, the spoon making lazy circles. He caught Mason's reflection in the glass and smiled to himself. Slow, deliberate. Some storms didn't need thunder. That night, the house on the cliffs listened to its own silence. The papers on the fridge fluttered in a draft the lists, the rules, the promises written in small letters. Claire's 3 rules trembled just enough to touch Mason's 12. Downstairs, Mason poured whiskey he didn't want, stared at the reflection of 2 pieces of paper swaying side by side. Upstairs, in the east room, Claire sat by the window, watching the waves crash against invisible rocks. Between them stretched the sound of a house trying to breathe through the wind. And somewhere beyond the glass, Seabright kept watching its whispers curling like smoke through every crack the cold could find. The first thaw came not with sunlight, but with sound, a slow drip from the eaves, soft as breathing. Overnight, the ice along the porch railing had loosened its grip, and the world below the lighthouse began to breathe again. Claire woke to the faint rhythm of water and the smell of coffee drifting from downstairs. The old house, for once, didn't groan. It sighed. When she stepped into the kitchen, Mason was at the counter, sleeves rolled, stirring sugar into his mug with absent focus. The radio murmured about tides and low pressure off the coast, a nor'easter forming somewhere near Cape Cod. "Morning," she said. He nodded without looking up. "You sleep, I tried." The wind kept talking. "That's the sea reminding you who's in charge. Good to know I'm not top of the list." Something like a smile tugged at his mouth, small, reluctant, but real. Claire caught it before he hid it behind his mug. She said nothing. Some things were better left as small miracles. She tied her hair back, found the ragged lighthouse logbook on the sideboard, the one Evelyn had used to record light rotations, storms, bird migrations. Its wooden table was cracked, one leg wobbling every time the wind pressed too hard on the house. "I'm fixing this today," she said. Mason looked up from the radio. "That table's been that way since '09. Then it's overdue. I was going to get to it." "Were you?" she asked lightly. He glanced at her, caught the faint teasing, and surrendered with a short breath. "You'll find the glue and clamps in the workshop." She nodded and carried the table into the small back room that still smelled of sawdust and turpentine. The place was an organized chaos of tools, each arranged by habit rather than label. She found the wood glue, wiped the dust off the bottle with her sleeve, and tested the nozzle clogged. Of course, she used a pin from her hair to clear it. By the time Mason walked in, she had the joint pressed, the clamps in place, her hands moving with quiet precision. "You've done this before," he said. "My dad was a carpenter," she replied. He said a good repair should be invisible, strong enough to hold, quiet enough not to brag. Mason leaned on the doorway, watching the sure way her fingers guided the wood together. "He sounds like a man I'd have liked." He wasn't always likable. Mason smiled faintly. "Then maybe I'd have liked him even more." The house creaked around them, wind shifting through the boards. The radio's voice carried faintly from the kitchen, barometric pressure dropping, gusts expected by nightfall. He checked the window, where clouds were already thickening over the horizon. "We'll need to sandbag the porch," he said. "If the wind hits from the north, the front steps will flood. I'll help." He hesitated. "I've got it." "I said I'll help. Mason." Her tone wasn't soft, but it wasn't confrontational either. It was the voice of someone who decided storms were better faced together than alone. He gave in with a small nod. "Gloves are in the mudroom." By afternoon, the light had turned pewter. The first edge of the storm brushed the cliffs, cold air sweeping through the pines. They worked side by side in the gray half-light, Mason hauling the heavy sandbags, Claire positioning them with precision against the porch rail. The smell of wet burlap mixed with sea salt. "Stack them at an angle," he said, "so the water slides off." She adjusted one, boots slipping on the slick boards. "Like this perfect." He handed her the next bag, their gloves brushing. No reaction, just shared breath in the cold. They worked without hurry, 2 steady rhythms sinking, the scrape of boots, the dull thud of sandbags landing. The wind began to roar low in the distance, a long, slow growl that made the air taste like iron. Claire wiped her forehead with her sleeve, exhaling white mist. "You've done this before. Too many times," he said. "Evelyn used to say the house swells before a storm, like it's bracing itself." "She was right," Claire murmured. "I can feel it." Another gust whipped past them, scattering dry leaves and a few early snowflakes. She reached for one last sandbag, the fabric tearing under her hand. Damn! The rough edge caught her wrist, a thin red line blooming across the pale skin. Mason saw it instantly. "You're bleeding." "It's fine," she said, brushing it off, but he was already stepping forward. "Let me see." "It's just—" He took her wrist gently, his thumb pressing just below the cut, the warmth of his palm steady against her skin. The gesture wasn't romantic. It was instinct, concern, something deeper and older than words. For a moment, the storm didn't exist. The wind hushed. The only sound was the steady rhythm of 2 breaths and the faint drip from the porch gutter. Her pulse fluttered under his hand. He looked at her, really looked not at the woman who shared his house by law, but at someone real, someone present. "You should clean it," he said softly. His voice had changed quieter, almost careful. "I will," she whispered. He held her wrist a second longer, then released it as though it might burn. Claire flexed her fingers, her heartbeat still stumbling. "Thank you." He nodded, stepping back, his jaw tightening not from discomfort, but from something he couldn't name. They finished the work without speaking. The storm rolled closer, wind slicing through the pines, the scent of rain thickening. When the last sandbag was placed, they both stood at the edge of the porch, looking out at the sea that was no longer silver but iron gray, restless, rising. "You ever notice," she said quietly, "how the air before a storm feels like a held breath?" He turned toward her. "And when it breaks, you remember how to breathe." She smiled small, tired, but enough. "Exactly." The first fat drops of rain struck the porch roof. 1, 2, then 1,000. Mason grabbed the empty sack pile and hauled it inside. Claire followed, the wind chasing her through the door. They closed it together, their shoulders brushing. The sound of the latch catching felt final, comforting. Inside, the lamps flickered. Water tapped the window panes like fingers asking to be let in. Claire held her wrist under the faucet, washing the blood away. Mason handed her a towel without a word. "Strong enough to hold," she said quietly, looking at the mended table drying by the wall. "Quiet enough not to brag." He finished. For a moment, their eyes met again, and this time, neither looked away first. Outside, the storm began to roar in earnest, but inside, for the first time since they'd met, the house didn't feel cold. It felt awake. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving behind a world scrubbed raw. Salt clung to every window, every nail in the frame. The air smelled of wet pine and copper. For a few hours, the lighthouse had hummed with quiet peace until the power died. The first pop came from the kitchen radio, a sharp crack, then silence. The lights flickered once, twice, then surrendered. The house groaned, the refrigerator clicked off, and the hum of modern life vanished, replaced by wind whispering through the eaves. Mason set his coffee down. "Transformer's gone," he said. "Probably took the whole line with it." Claire stood by the window, pulling her sweater tighter. "How long does it take to fix?" "Could be hours. Could be days. Days its main," he said, almost smiling. "We don't rush nature here." She exhaled a small cloud of breath, visible even indoors. 42 degrees, she murmured, glancing at the old mercury thermometer nailed by the door. Evelyn would have lit every lantern in the house by now. "Then that's what we'll do." He went to the basement for supplies, and she began gathering matches from the drawers. The house, stripped of its usual hum, felt both larger and smaller, as though every sound mattered now. Her footsteps on the floorboards, the match striking, the faint hiss before the flame bloomed. One by one, the lanterns woke in the kitchen, in the hall, on the stairs. Circles of gold spilled across walls lined with Evelyn's old books, casting soft shadows that seemed to breathe. Mason returned with an armful of wool blankets and a flashlight. "Basement's colder," he said. "Lanterns are better." Claire smiled. "Lanterns are kinder." He set one down on the table. "Kerosene's running low. We'll have to ration." She laughed softly. "You say that like we're stranded at sea." "In a way, we are." Outside, fog was rolling in from the water, thick, white, endless. The lighthouse beam had been dark since Evelyn's death, its mechanism still waiting for the funding she'd never lived to finish. Without it, the house stood blind above the ocean, like a sentinel that had forgotten its duty. They sat at the table, the glow between them small but steady. The quiet stretched easy this time. Claire flipped through the restored logbook, her fingertips brushing the margins where Evelyn's tidy handwriting listed tides and bird species. "She wrote this on my birthday," Claire murmured, tapping a date near the top. "March 12th. Mason looked up. "That's tomorrow." She nodded. "Funny timing. I almost forgot." Her voice wavered just a thread, but enough to make him look closer. He said nothing. After a moment, she closed the logbook and rested both hands on it. "It would have been my son's birthday, too. He didn't stay long enough to see the light." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was reverent. Mason could hear the wind tugging at the windows, the faint scrape of tree branches against the shingles. "I'm sorry," he said finally. She gave a small, tired smile. "It was a long time ago, but storms like this, they remember. Sometimes the body remembers too." Her hands trembled slightly, and she pulled them back into her lap. Mason stood, walked to the coat rack, and took down one of the wool blankets, thick, navy, frayed along the edges. He paused behind her, unsure. "May I?" She nodded without looking up. He draped the blanket around her shoulders, the motion slow, careful. The fabric brushed her neck, his fingers, her collarbone. For a moment, he felt the warmth of her through the wool, not heat. "Exactly. But presence." "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't answer. The lantern flame wavered, reflecting in the glass, painting both their faces in soft amber. When he turned to adjust the wick, her hand rose unintentionally, instinctively, and her fingers grazed his forearm. Just that a quiet, human touch in a cold room. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. For a long heartbeat, neither of them moved. The air seemed to pause around them, holding its breath. Then she let go, her voice barely more than a breath. "Sorry, don't be." His tone was even almost kind. Sometimes touch is how we say we're still here. The wind moaned against the window like an echo of his words. They both turned toward the fog. Outside, the sea was invisible, only the faint rhythm of waves hitting rock. Somewhere beyond, unseen, a foghorn sounded once deep, lonely, comforting. Mason picked up the lantern and carried it toward the living room, where the wide window looked out over the cliff. Claire followed, the blanket still around her shoulders. They stood side by side, faces pale in the reflected light. "The beam used to cut right through fog like this," he said. "You could see it from 20 miles out. And now," he shook his head, "now it's just a shell. Needs a new lens, new wiring. The town keeps talking about restoring it, but no one wants to pay for ghosts." She leaned closer to the glass, breath fogging the pain. "Maybe it doesn't need to be for ships anymore." He frowned slightly. "What else would a lighthouse be for?" She turned to him, eyes soft, glowing with the lantern's reflection. "Some lights aren't for ships," she said quietly. "They're for people." He met her gaze, and for a moment the years between them, the walls they'd built, all the ghosts that filled this house, they fell away. What remained was something simple, two souls who had lost, still choosing to keep the light on. He exhaled slowly. Evelyn would have liked that. She already knew. The lantern flickered again, low fuel burning to a whisper. Mason lowered the wick until the flame steadied. Claire tightened the blanket around her shoulders, her shiver easing. "Tomorrow," he said after a while, "we'll go up to the lantern room. See what can be fixed. You don't have to do that for me." "I'm not," he said. "I'm doing it for the house." It doesn't like the dark. She smiled faintly, eyes drifting back to the window. Outside, the fog swallowed the world whole, leaving only the faint echo of the sea steady, tireless. He reached for another lantern, set it near the stairwell, and paused on the first step. She stayed by the glass, haloed by light. For the first time since Evelyn's passing, Mason felt the house settle not in grief, but in something gentler, as if, finally, it recognized the warmth it had been waiting for. Claire pressed her palm against the window, watching the reflection of the lantern's glow fade into the mist. "Some lights aren't for ships," she whispered again, softer this time. "They're for people who forgot they still need one." Mason looked back at her, just a silhouette, in gold and gray, and said quietly, "Then let's keep it burning." The storm passed, but something colder settled in its place. The sky cleared to a hard, glassy blue, the kind that made everything look sharper, crueler. Mason was in town early, delivering design sketches for the lighthouse restoration to the county office. He hadn't planned to stay long. He never did. His phone buzzed as he stepped off the curb. Unknown number. No message, just a photo. He opened it. Claire, sitting at a diner table. Grant Mallory across from her, leaning in close. Her expression unreadable. The timestamp blurred, the corner cropped. Below the image, a single line. "She's not who you think she is." The street seemed to tilt under his feet. Wind off the harbor slapped his coat, but the cold came from inside. He stared at the image again, zoomed in the way Mallory's hand rested on the table, the faint smile on Claire's lips, the same chipped coffee mug from the Lantern Diner. He could almost hear the clatter of plates, the low murmur of voices, her saying Evelyn would never have sold to men like you. But in this photo, she didn't look like someone refusing. She looked involved. He pocketed the phone and kept walking. Faster now. Claire was at the house when he returned, kneeling beside the hearth, sorting lanterns and fresh oil cans. She looked up, smiling faintly. "You're back early." He didn't answer. The sound of the door closing behind him was sharper than he intended. She frowned. "Everything okay?" He crossed the room, placed the phone on the table between them. "When were you going to tell me?" Her smile faded. "Tell you what, that you met Mallory again." The silence after that was almost kind, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Her brow furrowed. "You saw us at the diner, Mason, weeks ago." "Not that," he said, tapping the phone. "This." When she glanced down, saw the photo, her shoulders went still. "Where did you get that? Does it matter?" "Yes," she said evenly. "It matters a great deal." He hesitated. "It was sent to me." "No name." "Of course it wasn't." She straightened slowly. "You think I'm working with him?" "I think I don't know what you're doing," he said, voice flat, careful. "And every time I look around, someone else seems to." Her eyes held his, unflinching. "You think I'd betray Evelyn's house? The children's fund, I think," he said. "That people have reasons for what they do. And I don't know yours." That landed like a blow, quiet but deep. She drew a breath that shivered only at the edges. "You don't have to know everything about me," she said. "You just have to trust that what we're doing here means something." He shook his head. "Trust isn't blind, Claire. It's earned. Then I guess I've failed your test." He looked at her hands steady, folded, no tremor. Her eyes didn't shine with tears. They shone with something harder. "I met him once after that day," she said, voice calm, deliberate, "at the library board meeting, in public, to tell him that his company can't file another claim on the property until we finish Evelyn's 6 months. I did it because someone had to." He stared at her, jaw set. "You could have told me." "I could have," she said, "if I thought you'd listen instead of suspect." He opened his mouth, closed it. The words that came next were small, defensive. "You should have known how that looks." "How it looks," she repeated. "That's the problem, isn't it? You care more about how things look than how they are." "Don't twist this. I don't have to." Her voice didn't rise. It fell, low and final. "You already did." The lamp flickered between them, its flame thinning with every word. She stepped closer, the scent of salt and wool still clinging to her from the porch earlier that morning. "You can doubt me, Mason," she said quietly. "But don't doubt the kids who need this place. Don't make Evelyn's work smaller because your fear is bigger." The words hit harder than any shout could. He turned away, hands gripping the back of the nearest chair. That's not fair." "Neither is this," she said, nodding toward the phone, a cropped picture and a choice to believe the worst. Her voice softened then, almost kind again. "You know, you and Mallory have one thing in common." He looked up, wary. "What's that?" "You both think everything can be bought trust, loyalty, forgiveness. But some of us learned the hard way that those things only live where faith does. And faith doesn't come with receipts." She reached for her coat. The lantern light trembled on the wall as she moved. "Where are you going?" he asked. "To clear my head." "It's late. It's cold," she said, opening the door. "And right now, that feels honest." The wind swept in, scattering a few loose pages from the table, Evelyn's old letters, sketches, receipts. Mason reached to catch them, but one slipped past, fluttering into the hallway like a small ghost. He didn't follow it. Claire stepped outside. The porch boards creaked beneath her boots. Behind her, the door stayed open a moment longer than it should have. He wanted to call after her, to say something anything but pride stood between them, tall as the lighthouse itself. Instead, he picked up the phone from the table, thumb hovering over the image. He zoomed in again, desperate for a clue he'd missed. The timestamp edge was blurred just enough to hide the date. It could have been yesterday, or months ago. It could have been nothing. The more he stared, the less certain he became. He locked the screen, tossed the phone onto the table, and sat down hard. The lamp flickered again, low on fuel. The flame leaned toward him, struggling for air. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, listening to the house shift around him, wood expanding, wind moving through cracks, the faint echo of waves striking stone. Outside, the foghorn sounded once, long and low, the kind of sound that reminded ships where not to go. He closed his eyes, the sound still in his chest. He could almost hear Claire's voice in it, calm, steady, resolute. "Don't doubt the kids who need this place." When he opened his eyes, the door was still open, letting in a thin thread of cold light. He thought about closing it, but couldn't bring himself to move. The house felt bigger again, not emptier, but watchful, as if it, too, were waiting to see who would step back inside first. The next morning, the house felt wrong. Not quiet wrong. The kind of wrong that lived in small absences, a missing mug from the counter, a chair slightly askew, the echo of footsteps that didn't return. Claire's boots were gone from the mat. Her coat, too. The wool blanket she always left folded on the couch was draped over the armrest instead, as if she'd stopped halfway and changed her mind about keeping it neat. Mason stood in the doorway, mug in hand, and listened. Nothing. Only the faint hum of the fridge and the distant, slow rhythm of the sea. He tried to convince himself this was fine that she'd gone to town, or to the library, or anywhere that didn't feel like running away. But when he looked at the calendar by the fridge, he saw her handwriting on yesterday's square. Library board, 4 p.m. The meeting was over. Whatever she'd needed to say to them, she'd already said. He drank his coffee, cold and bitter, more habit than comfort, then pulled on his coat. The drive into Seabright felt longer than usual, the roads slick from overnight frost. The world outside his window was muted, drained of color, a salt gray morning after a storm of his own making. At the county office, he signed in, pretending he was there to check on the permit for the lighthouse repairs. The clerk, a young man with kind eyes and a terrible tie, smiled politely. "Mr. Hale, right. We've been meaning to ask if you could look at the security feed from last month. Our camera on the east side's been freezing up." He blinked. "Security feed." The clerk nodded. "Yeah, the one by the diner. Captures the street in front of the municipal building. Might help us figure out when it cut out." The words landed like a small, sharp stone in his chest. "Can I see it?" "Sure, if you've got 5 minutes." 5 minutes later, Mason was staring at the same diner window he'd seen in that photo, the one that had stolen sleep, and replaced it with suspicion. The timestamp glowed faintly in the corner of the grainy screen. He zoomed in. February 6, 9, 12 of them. Then he scrolled forward. The image jumped. Claire sitting at the table with Grant Mallory. Mallory leaning forward, smiling that too smooth smile. And then a gesture Mason had never seen before, Claire pushing the folder back across the table, shaking her head firmly. The next frame she stood, dropped a few bills, and walked out. Mallory stayed seated, staring after her. His smile gone. Mason leaned closer, the world narrowing to the flicker of the screen. He scrubbed back to the start, paused again. The timestamp hadn't been cropped by accident. Someone had edited it to hide the date. It wasn't recent. It was the first week of February, before the storm, before the night of the lanterns. His chest felt hollow. He replayed the clip once more, slower this time, until Claire's exit froze mid-step. Her face in that instant wasn't soft or secretive. It was resolute. She hadn't betrayed Evelyn's legacy. She'd defended it, and he'd accused her anyway. The clerk's voice startled him. "Everything look okay?" He nodded, words caught in his throat. "Yeah, just what I needed." The drive back to Hale Light blurred by in fragments salt on the windshield, the radio mumbling about clear skies, the same blue horizon she used to watch from the window seat. When he opened the door, the smell of coffee and paper greeted him like a ghost. The living room looked untouched, but emptier. He saw the list on the fridge still hanging. No cruelty. No lying. Eat at the same table. His own rules hung above it. Neat and heartless. 12 of them, suddenly meaningless. He went upstairs, searching for something to do, something to fix. That was what he did when guilt came. He built, or broke, or measured. He picked up a book from the nightstand, Evelyn's collected letters, and felt something slide loose from underneath. A brown envelope, sealed, his name in her handwriting. He sat down hard on the edge of the bed. The envelope wasn't heavy, but it carried weight. He hesitated before opening it. Inside were papers, a grant proposal. Neatly typed, pages creased from being read too many times. Project title, The Hale Light Literacy Expansion Initiative. He skimmed the summary. Her plan was to double the size of the reading center, add new programs for fishermen's families, veterans, single parents. She'd secured matching funds from 3 regional donors. All she'd needed was his signature as co-trustee, and she hadn't asked, because he hadn't been someone she could ask. A small note was clipped to the last page. In blue ink, her handwriting curved gentle, precise. If we can keep this place alive for even one more generation, then maybe Evelyn's light won't go out. Thank you for building walls strong enough for books to rest against. C. The paper trembled in his hands. For a moment, he didn't breathe. Then, slowly, he folded the pages back into the envelope and stared at them, the way one stares at something holy and cruel at once. He sat down on the floor, knees to his chest, elbows on his thighs, and let the quiet fill every corner. The sound of the sea below reached him faintly through the floorboards, steady as a heartbeat. He thought about her voice. "You can doubt me, Mason, but don't doubt the kids who need this place." He thought about his own flat, defensive, afraid. The clock ticked somewhere down the hall. Outside, gulls cried over the cliffs. He pressed the envelope to his chest, a single breath catching in his throat. "God," he whispered, "what did I do?" No one answered. The only reply came from the wind slipping through the cracks, gentle, unblaming, like forgiveness offered too early. He sat there until the light changed morning to noon, noon to amber dusk. His coffee went cold beside him. His phone buzzed once, a message from the library board reminding him of next week's meeting. He didn't open it. When he finally rose, his knees ached, his fingers stiff from holding still too long. He walked downstairs, poured the coffee into the sink, and stood there staring at the dark swirl until it vanished. The house was still again, not judging, just waiting. He reached out, almost without thinking, and moved her list from beneath his lifting it. pinning it alone to the center of the fridge. The magnet clicked softly. No cruelty. No lying. Eat at the same table. He traced the words with one finger, then let his hand fall. The kitchen clock ticked on, counting time that could never be unspent. And somewhere outside, far down the cliffs, a single gull circled the darkening sea, calling for someone who'd already flown too far to hear. Snow came late that year, not soft, storybook flakes, just a steadied gray sleet that fell sideways in the wind. The cliffs below, hail light hissed under it, the waves churning black and heavy. Mason stood at the window, mug cooling in his hand, watching the sea blur into the sky. The house felt different now. Still, yes, but not calm, like it was waiting for him to say something. He'd spent 3 days moving through its rooms without direction. He fixed nothing, built nothing, barely ate. The grant envelope lay on the dining table, corners curling. Her handwriting, those curved letters, had become a wound he couldn't look at or throw away. He wanted to tell her he'd seen the video. He wanted to tell her he'd been wrong, but there was no number to call, no address. She hadn't left one. The sleet thickened. A shingle rattled loose on the roof, somewhere upstairs. A door thudded softly against its frame, the west room, the one he never entered. For a long time he just listened to it, the dull, rhythmic tap of wood against wood. Then, without deciding to, he went up the stairs. The key still hung from a nail by the banister. It had been there for years. He took it down. The lock turned with a slow, gritty sound. The door opened. Dust swirled in the dim light from the hallway. Everything was as Rebecca had left it, the drafting table angled toward the window, rolls of paper stacked neatly in their tubes, her old sweater draped over the chair. He hadn't touched this room since the funeral. He'd told himself it was respect. But now, standing there, he knew it was cowardice. He stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of graphite and lavender soap, the ghost of her presence still clinging to the wood. His fingers brushed over the table's edge. Beneath one corner of the mat lay a slip of yellowed paper, folded small. He hesitated, then opened it. Her handwriting, quick and looping, filled the page. Forgive the world quickly. It doesn't know what to do with grief that stays too long. He stood still until the words blurred. He could almost hear her laugh, light and brief, the one she used when she said something wise by accident. Forgive the world quickly. He sank into the chair and pressed the note against his palm. For years, he'd blamed everyone: the drunk driver, the rain, himself, even the roads. Now he saw it clearly. He'd built a house of grief and called it devotion. Every brick of silence, every rule he'd made, was another wall to keep out forgiveness. Outside, sleet struck the window like soft applause. The noise of it filled the room. He looked again at the note, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. When he stood, the decision was already made. It took him half an hour to scrape ice off the windshield and another half to drive the winding 8 miles inland to Seabright Care Home. The wipers beat an uneven rhythm against the sleet. The tires hissed through slush. The heater hummed low, but his hands stayed cold. He hadn't called ahead. He didn't know what he would say, if Claire was there or if she wasn't. The parking lot was nearly empty when he arrived. A single light flickered above the entrance, haloed by falling snow. He parked close to the door and sat for a moment, engine idling, breath fogging the windshield. Forgive the world quickly, he murmured. Then he shut off the ignition and stepped out into the wet wind. Inside, the care home smelled of antiseptic and baked apples. Christmas decorations still hung from the ceiling, even though February was almost gone. Paper stars, curling ribbons, a garland of faded lights that hummed faintly. The receptionist looked up. "Can I help you?" "Sir, I'm looking for Margaret Whitmore," he said. His voice came out rougher than he meant. "She's a patient here." The woman checked her chart, nodded. Room 112, but visiting hours ended at 6. He glanced at the clock. 6:07. "Please, I won't stay long." Something in his tone, or maybe his face, must have convinced her. She hesitated, then said quietly, "She's awake, but her daughter's with her." His heart kicked once, sharp and low. Claire. Yes, sir. Been here most of the day. He nodded. Thank you. The hallway was narrow, lined with soft yellow light. He walked slowly, each step muffled by carpet. The smell of snow followed him in, faint and clean. When he reached room 112, the door was open a crack. Through it, he saw Claire sitting beside the bed, her hand resting gently over her mother's. Margaret's eyes were closed, her breathing steady, a small smile flickering across her lips as Claire hummed something a lullaby. Maybe one of those tunes that carry no words, just warmth. Mason stood in the doorway, hat in hand, unsure if he had the right to step closer. Claire turned before he spoke. She must have felt him there, the shift of air, the quiet presence that years of solitude can't disguise. Her face didn't show surprise, only weariness. Mason. He nodded once. I'm sorry. For what everything, he said. For believing less than you deserved. Her eyes searched his face, not angry, just cautious. You saw the footage. I did. And your grant proposal. He reached into his coat, pulled out the envelope, slightly crumpled. I found this under Evelyn's book. She took it, fingers brushing his glove. You weren't meant to see it yet. I wasn't meant to doubt you either. Her mouth trembled once, then steadied. You came all the way out here in this weather to tell me that he half smiled, tired. Evelyn would have called it a field trip for humility. That earned a soft breath of laughter. The sound loosened something in his chest. I wanted to bring you coffee, he added, lifting the paper cup he'd picked up at the gas station. It's not good. She looked at it, then at him, then reached out and took it anyway. It's warm, she said quietly. That's enough. He stood there in the doorway while she sipped, the smell of burnt roast filling the small room. Her mother stirred slightly, eyelids fluttering. Claire leaned forward, smoothing the blanket. She has good days and bad, Claire said softly. Tonight's good. He nodded. She's lucky. Claire smiled faintly. She'd say we're all lucky, even when we don't look like it. Mason shifted his weight, the paper cup cooling between his hands. I don't know if she'd want a stranger standing here. You're not a stranger, Claire said. You just forgot who you were for a while. He looked down, humbled by the mercy in that sentence. I'm trying to remember. Outside the window, sleet tapped gently against the glass. A nurse passed in the hallway, shoes squeaking on the linoleum. Time moved softly here, without judgment. When Margaret's breathing deepened again, Claire stood and walked him to the hall. You should get home before the roads freeze. He hesitated. If you need a ride, I'll stay until she sleeps. He nodded. Then I'll wait in the parking lot, just to make sure you get out safe. She tilted her head, half smiling, half sad. You don't have to do that. I know, he said. That's why I want to. She didn't answer. She just looked at him a moment longer. Something unspoken passing between them, he couldn't name it. But it felt like the beginning of being forgiven. He turned and walked back down the hall. The cup trembled slightly in his hand, a small ripple across the surface. When he reached the door, he glanced once more over his shoulder. Claire was still standing by the room, framed in warm light. She looked tired, but peaceful. Outside, the night pressed cold against his face. He started the truck, wipers groaning across the glass. The road ahead shimmered with sleet. He drove slowly, the headlights cutting through falling silver, the words in his pocket whispering against the fabric of his coat. Forgive the world quickly. For the first time in years, he tried. The chapel inside Seabright Care Home was small, no stained glass, no organ, no preacher, just a row of wooden pews and a single brass cross that caught the dim morning light. The air smelled faintly of wax and lemon oil. Mason sat in the back pew for a long time before realizing he wasn't really sitting. He was hiding. It was early. Nurses whispered down the hall, wheels of breakfast carts squeaking softly. Claire's mother was still sleeping. Claire herself had stepped outside for a phone call, but he hadn't followed. Not this time. He had come here because there was nowhere else left to go that felt honest. The silence pressed close, like hands on his shoulders. He stood, then dropped to one knee. Not out of faith, out of exhaustion, out of the simple need to stop running from gravity. The wood was cold beneath him. He folded his hands. Though he didn't know what prayer was supposed to sound like anymore, when he finally spoke, his voice came out low, uneven. "I failed her," he whispered. "And I failed you, too. Rebecca." He looked up at the cross, the brass reflecting the faint pulse of the overhead lights. "I thought if I made the house perfect, it would make the guilt smaller, but it didn't. It just got heavier." He took a slow breath, the kind that scrapes on the way out. "There was a crash," he said. "Outside Boston. You were driving. I was supposed to be there. But I stayed late arguing over blueprints, thinking one more hour would make me worthy of what we had." His hands tightened together. "You called. I didn't pick up. 10 minutes later, the bridge iced. They said the driver lost control, but I lost something first, your voice, and I've been trying to rebuild it ever since." The words came faster now, the way they do when silence finally cracks. "I told myself I'd never let anyone close again. I made rules, walls, whole architectures of distance, every beam, every nail, a way to keep the world out. And when Claire walked into that house, I treated her like she was one more threat to what little I had left." He stopped, the breath catching. She wasn't. She was the one person trying to keep Evelyn's light burning. And I doubted her, because believing would have meant forgiving myself first. His shoulders shook once, not with sobbing, but with something quieter, the body's small rebellion against too much restraint. Footsteps echoed softly behind him. Mason. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. The voice was enough. Claire stood in the doorway, coat unbuttoned, her hair still damp from the snow outside. She'd come back looking for him, maybe because the silence in the hall had changed temperature, maybe because something in her still believed he was salvageable. He exhaled, eyes closing. "I didn't mean for you to hear this." "Then why come here?" she asked gently. "Because I didn't know how else to speak without breaking something." She stepped closer, her boots barely making a sound on the thin carpet. When she stopped beside him, she saw the way his hands trembled, the way his body leaned toward the pew for balance. He opened his eyes but didn't look at her. "I accused you of lying," he said quietly, "but I'm the one who's been lying the longest." She waited, not pressing. "I tell people my wife died in an accident," he continued, "but that's not the truth. She died because I didn't pick up the phone, because I thought work mattered more than a few words in the dark. That night has been a loop in my head for 7 years. Every storm, every silence, it plays again." His voice thinned, nearly gone. "So I punished the world, built a house around my failure and called it structure." He let the last sentence fall into the stillness. It landed softly, like dust. Claire's breath hitched once. She knelt beside him, not too close. Not yet. The chapel light brushed her face, gentle and warm. "You think pain proves something," she said. He looked at her, eyes raw. "Doesn't it?" She shook her head. "Pain isn't proof. Mason, it's just pain. Proof is what you build after it." The words found him like water on cracked earth. Not loud, not bright, but enough. He looked down at his hands, then up at hers. "I don't know how to build anything that doesn't start with guilt. Then build from honesty," she said. "It's heavier, but it lasts." He almost smiled, small and crooked. "That sounds like something Evelyn would have said. Maybe she's still teaching us." The clock above the doorway ticked once, marking time the way only clocks in quiet places can. Mason let out a shaky breath, the kind that clears space inside the chest. "I wanted to ask for forgiveness," he said, "but I think that's too much to ask." Claire looked at him for a long moment, then placed her hand over his, the same wrist he'd touched that night on the porch, when the storm raged and neither of them understood what the other carried. Her touch was steady, warm, alive. "You don't have to ask," she said. "You just have to mean it." He met her eyes. There was no pity there, only recognition, one survivor seeing another. The chapel's heater kicked on, a low hum under their silence. Dust motes spun slowly in the light. He whispered, I'm tired of being the man who can't forgive." "Then stop being him," she said simply. He nodded, eyes damp but steady now. For the first time, he wasn't holding back tears out of pride. He was letting them fall because they belonged to someone human. Claire stood, offering him her hand. He took it. When he rose, his knees cracked, and they both laughed softly, the sound of it startling and tender in that hollow room. They walked out side by side, the smell of wax and wood following them. In the hallway, a nurse passed, smiled politely, unaware that anything had shifted. But something had small, invisible, irreversible. As they reached the door, Mason glanced once more toward the chapel. The light inside flickered gently, as if bowing them out. Outside, the sleet had turned to rain softer now, melting what had frozen. They stood beneath the awning, not speaking. Water ran off the gutters in thin silver threads. After a long moment, he said quietly, "You know, I never really prayed before." Claire looked at him. "Maybe you just did." He smiled, the kind that starts small and stays. And for the first time since the crash, Mason Hale felt the ground beneath him not as punishment, but as mercy. The letter arrived in a manila envelope that looked official enough to be truthful. Mason slid it open with his thumb. A single page slid out, heavy paper, seal at the top. Notice of injunction. Emergency motion to condemn Hale Light. Basis structural instability per third-party survey. Hearing set in 30 days. He read it twice, then again, as if repetition could subtract meaning. A second document stapled behind it carried a logo he didn't recognize, North Shore Engineering Group. The survey bristled with bolded phrases: sheer failure, compromised footings, imminent risk. The numbers were wrong, the math lazy. He felt the heat rise in his neck. "Claire," he called, voice too level to match the thunder in his chest. She came in from the porch, cheeks pink from the wind. A box of donated children's books in her arms. "What's wrong?" He handed it over. She scanned, eyes narrowing. He found a way to make the town do his work for him. "Grant Mallory doesn't build things," Mason said, jaw set. "He undermines them." Claire pulled her hair into a knot, practical and steady. "This survey, any of these numbers mean anything. They mean someone copy-pasted fear," Mason said. "No core samples, no footing photo, no load tests. They didn't even include the soil type." "Then we prove it," she said, with real numbers. He was already reaching for his phone. His fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second over a name he hadn't dialed in years. Then he pressed. The line clicked. Torres Concrete, a voice barked. "Make it fast." "Pours at noon." "It's Hale," Mason said. A beat. "You're calling ghosts now. Thought you married a lighthouse. I need a core rig. A Schmidt hammer, 2 techs. And your meanest foreman," Mason said. "Inside a week." The voice softened, amused. "Same old Hale. What am I driving into? A developer with a fake survey and a town council that scares easy." Another voice cut in Sonia, structural engineer, Boston tough and brilliant. The one he'd always trusted when trust meant numbers. "I'm listening." "Masonry tower on shale," he said. "Footings poured 1896, reinforced twice 1931 and 1978. No vertical cracking last inspection. Need compressive strength tests. Foundation mapping. The works. I can get you a GPR unit and a crew," Sonia said. "But Hale, if it's bad..." "I'm saying it's bad." He exhaled. "If it's bad, we fix it or we let it go. I want truth, not favors." A pause. "Then I'll bring the truth." He ended the call and looked at Claire. "We'll need the council to let us open the site. Public inspection. No closed doors. We show the town everything." She nodded, resolve settling over her like a coat. "Council meets tonight. I'll get on the agenda." The phone on the wall was ancient. It still made a little click when she hung up. She gathered a slim folder grant proposal. Endowment figures. Names of 50 families who used the reading room last year. "Numbers tell cold stories," she said, tapping the folder. "But faces make them warm." They drove into town together. The sky was the color of tin. Flags along Main Street snapped in the wind. The council hall smelled like varnish and coffee that had been warming on a burner since sunrise. People filled the rows, fishermen in flannel, teachers clutching folders, retirees with folded arms, and in the back, Grant Mallory, immaculate as ever, phone face down on his knee, patience arranged on his face like jewelry. The council chair rapped a gavel. Next item, emergency motion to condemn Hale Light, per North Shore Engineering Group's findings. Murmurs. A few heads turned toward Claire and Mason. Mallory's lip tilted. Just enough. Claire walked to the microphone. No paper rattle, no trembling. "I'm Claire Whitmore," she said, "Evelyn Voss's goddaughter. I help run the reading center at Hale Light. 46 children checked out books last week. 3 veterans used the quiet room to fill out VA forms. This isn't a ruin. It's a refuge. If we take it down, we don't just lose a tower, we lose a place that keeps people upright." A hand shot up from the second row. "Mr. Carver, the lobster man with 40 winters behind his eyes." "Ma'am, if a survey says she's unsafe, we can't risk kids on those stairs." "Agreed," Claire said, "which is why we're asking for a real inspection anyone can watch. We'll bring independent engineers, people with licenses and reputations they care about. Let's test the mortar, map the footings, read the beams, and let every one of you see it. If it's unsafe, we'll be the first to close the door. But if it's safe, let's not let fear do our voting." Eyes shifted. Mallory leaned forward, smile sharpened. "With respect, Ms. Whitmore, engineering isn't theater, it's measurements. Our partners, your partners." Mason cut in, voice calm, clear, carried by timber and truth. "Filed a survey without core data. You cite sheer failure without a single rebound test. You dated the foundation to 1904 when the Lighthouse archive shows 1896. You can afford a better forgery." A low rumble rolled through the room, half laugh, half growl. Mallory's fingers tightened on his phone. "Mr. Hale, personal attacks won't change the fact that a public hazard exists. If it exists." Mason said, "Let's prove it. I've already called a Boston crew. They'll be here within the week. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust physics." From the aisle, Mrs. Henley from the diner raised her chin. "My granddaughter reads at that lighthouse. If there's a test, I want to see it with my own eyes." "Me too," said a teacher. "Let's make it public." The chair tapped the gavel to settle the rising voices. He glanced at the town attorney, who shrugged in the rhythm of small towns. "Why not?" Motion to allow a public inspection of Hale Light by independent engineers. With results entered into the record, hands went up more than half. The motion carried. A murmur of relief moved like wind through tall grass. Beside the exit, Mallory's smile didn't break, but it cooled several degrees. He stood with practiced ease. "Of course," he said smoothly, "transparency serves us all." His eyes slid to Claire, then to Mason. "I'll look forward to the findings." Outside, the evening had turned to steel. When the council dismissed, people spilled onto the steps. Collars turned up, conversations tight with adrenaline. A few clapped Claire on the shoulder as they passed. Carver gave a small nod to Mason, the kind men use when words cost too much. They walked down the steps together. "Thank you," Claire said, for what Mason asked, for speaking like an engineer, not a soldier. He almost smiled. "I wanted to swing. I chose to measure. That's a better legacy." They reached the truck. Claire paused, looked back at the hall's bright windows. "He won't stop," she said, "even if we win the test." "No," Mason said, "but he won't be alone in the room next time." They drove home with the heater on high, the tires humming over blacktop turned blue by night. At the house, the wind had risen. They grabbed flashlights and checked the catwalk, the door bolts, the sandbags they'd left stacked on the porch. Work steadied their hands. Back inside, the kitchen light made a small island of warmth. Claire set her folder on the table and opened it to the page that listed donors, 3 names underlined, 2 more circled. "If the tower tests sound," she said, "we go public with the expansion plan. We show the town what this place can become. We build it in the open." Mason said, She nodded. In the open. The phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Sonia Crew confirmed. Friday. Weather permitting. Bring coffee. Strong. Mason texted back. Always. He looked at Claire. The worry lines at the corners of her mouth, the grit in her posture. We'll need volunteers for crowd control, he said. Caution tape. Cones. I'll mark a safe perimeter 30 feet from the base. I'll rally the teachers, she said. And Mrs. Henley. She's scarier than any caution tape. They both laughed, short, genuine. Then the laughter faded, replaced by the sober cadence of planning. Lists formed. Pens scratched. The house listened, approving. Wind pressed the windows once more, firm palms on old glass. Mason glanced at the lantern he'd left on the sideboard. Its wick glowed like a waiting ember. He turned the knob. The flame rose. From the cliff, the sea answered with a hidden roar. In the flicker, their shadows overlapped on the wall, two outlines that didn't quite know how to fit. Learning anyway. They stood a moment like that, letting the warmth reach their faces, the sound of the ocean carry their next breath. Then a new sound cut the room. 4 hard knocks on the door. Not wind, not wood settling. Knuckles. Deliberate. They looked at each other. The flame steadied, small and bright. Mason moved first. The morning of the inspection broke clear and hard, the kind of February light that bleaches color from everything but courage. Frost silvered the grass around Hale Light. The sea below was a flat mirror of steel. By 8, the trucks had arrived, 2 from Boston, 1 local flatbed carrying tool chests, tripods, and the ground-penetrating radar rig. Sonia Torres climbed out first, pulling her wool cap low and scanning the tower with a professional's hunger. Beautiful, she said. Ugly reports don't happen to beautiful structures. Mason almost smiled. They do when beauty's valuable. She grinned. Then let's give her numbers back. The townspeople gathered on the slope. Teachers, fishermen, kids holding mugs of cocoa. Claire moved among them, calm, answering questions, explaining what each test would show. Even Mrs. Henley, the diner matron, had brought a box of muffins and a face that dared anyone to call this place unsafe. By 9, the air buzzed with equipment. Hammers tapped. The radar beeped softly, mapping the veins of the old tower. Sonia called out readings. No subsidence. Mortar density stable. Shear lines clean. Mason followed her with a clipboard, jotting numbers, eyes bright with focus. He hadn't looked this alive in years. From the edge of the crowd, Grant Mallory watched with his usual half-smile. His coat was too fine for the wind, his shoes sinking slightly into the wet ground. He didn't come to be convinced, he came to witness the collapse he'd engineered. But the tower refused to collapse. At 10:30, Sonia's assistant drilled a small test hole into the outer wall near the base. Dust puffed out, pale and dry. Mason knelt to brush it away and felt something hollow beneath the stone. A faint echo. Stop, he said. Drill there again. Slower. The bit caught. Scraped metal. Sonia frowned. Cavity. He pried the stone loose with a chisel. Behind it, the lantern light caught on the edge of something metallic, a tin box wedged between support beams. The crowd leaned in as he eased it free. The hinges groaned open. Inside lay a folded letter, the paper yellow but dry, wrapped in oilcloth. Claire's hand covered her mouth. That's Evelyn's handwriting. Mallory's smirk faltered. Mason unfolded it carefully, the ink still legible, strong strokes of a woman who never whispered. He read aloud, voice steady but low enough to make people lean closer. If you're reading this, the house has already tested you. I never wrote that clause to trap you. I wrote it to buy time for you, Mason Hale, and for whoever fate brought to keep the light burning beside you. I saw what grief does to good people. It makes them think they're finished. But this place doesn't save itself. It needs 2 souls willing to stay until the storm breaks. If you've stayed 6 months, you've already proven the point. The foundation of this house was never its stone. It was belief in repair, in forgiveness, in building again. Don't sell what isn't broken. Evelyn Voss, July 17th, 10 years ago. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the sea slow, constant, like applause heard through glass. Claire blinked back tears. She knew. She whispered. She planned everything. Mason folded the letter and placed it back in the tin, his hand trembling only once. She always said, houses teach lessons slower than people. He murmured, "Guess this one took its time." Sonia straightened, brushing dust from her gloves. "Well," she said briskly, "shall we see if her faith holds up to physics?" They ran the final readings. Sensors hummed, data printed out in long, curling strips. Sonia studied them, her pencil tapping the page. Then she smiled, sharp and proud. Compressive strength exceeds modern code by 22%. Foundation shift 0. Shear margin safe by a mile. Whoever poured this concrete knew what forever looked like. The crowd erupted cheers, claps, relieved laughter. Even the gulls seemed to join in, their cries sharper, higher. Mallory's expression froze. "You'll forgive me if I ask for verification," he said smoothly. "Our firm's findings are fraudulent." Sonia cut in, holding up her clipboard. "No GPS metadata, no material samples, no registered engineer signature. You want verification, I'll send this to the state licensing board myself." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cameras came out, phones lifted. Someone shouted, "Show the real report." Another voice, "You lied." "Mallory." He raised his hands, but the tide had already turned. His smile curdled. "I see this town still prefers sentiment to science." "Funny." Mason said, stepping forward, voice clear. "Science just saved the sentiment." Mallory looked at him for a long, icy second, then turned on his heel and strode to his car. Tires spun in the gravel, spitting frost as he drove off down the hill. Applause followed him out. Claire exhaled shakily, the sound half laugh, half relief. "You think he'll come back?" "He'll try," Mason said. "Men like that don't understand losing quietly, but he'll find the ground's firmer than it looks." Sonia grinned. "Speaking of ground, want to see your new report?" She handed him the folder. On top, in neat print, were the words "Structural Integrity Sound, recommended use educational and community facility." He stared at the word sound until it blurred. Claire touched his sleeve. She'd be proud. He looked at her. Really looked, and something in his expression softened. The old iron melting around the edges. She already is. They turned to face the crowd, who were still clustered near the base, hands on the cold stone as though to steady it, or perhaps to let it steady them. Mrs. Henley handed out muffins like communion. Kids ran around the sandbags, shouting that the lighthouse wasn't falling after all. Sonia packed up her tools, pausing only to glance at the sky. "You know," she said, "I've seen a lot of towers fail. Never seen one teach people how to stand." Mason laughed quietly. This one's had practice. When the trucks finally pulled away, leaving tire tracks in thawing mud, the slope emptied. Only Mason, Claire, and the house remained. They climbed the narrow stairs to the lantern room as the afternoon light broke free from a bank of clouds. The beam mechanism still waited in silence, dust on brass, glass streaked with salt. Claire ran her hand along the railing. "Think she meant for us to find that letter today. She always liked good timing," Mason said. Below them, the town spread small and bright, roofs shining with frost. The sea glinted silver again. He took the letter from his pocket, unfolded it once more, reading Evelyn's last line aloud, slowly this time, so every word could breathe. "Don't sell what isn't broken." He folded it carefully and slipped it back into the tin. "Guess that means us, too," he said. Claire smiled, eyes wet but shining. "Then let's make sure we're worth keeping." The wind picked up, carrying the faint echo of applause from the crowd still dispersing down the hill. Inside the lantern room, the two of them stood in the gold light, dust swirling like stars. Mason rested one hand on the old brass lever. "Time to test if she still remembers how to shine," he said. And as he turned the crank, the mechanism groaned awake, a low, familiar hum rising through the bones of the tower. The first beam cut through the fog, wide and sure, sweeping over the gray water like a blessing returned. For a long while, neither spoke. When he finally did, it was almost a whisper. Proofs in the beams. She nodded, eyes on the light, and in the people who keep them burning. The calendar on the fridge had been marked since the first week 6 months, a date that once looked like an exit. Now it sat there, small and unassuming, like a secret they both already knew. The clause was fulfilled, the papers could be filed, no one in town would judge. The estate would pass to the foundation, the reading center secure. Their marriage, legal, temporary, necessary, could dissolve with nothing left to bind them. Mason stood by the kitchen window, morning coffee untouched. The sea below was calm, the kind of calm that hides its strength. Claire moved quietly behind him, gathering the last set of reports for the grant committee. The house had stopped feeling like a stage. It had become what Evelyn meant it to be, a place that asked people who they were when no one was watching. "You know what today is," she said softly. He nodded. "I do." "And what it means." He looked out at the horizon, light gathering in slow bands of gold. "It means we did what we promised." She smiled faintly. "Promises are easy when someone else writes them for you." He turned then, meeting her gaze. There was no tension, only the strange tenderness that comes when two people reach the same thought from different sides. "I don't want this to end just because the law says we can let go," he said. "But I also don't want to hold on because the law made us start." Claire placed the folder on the counter. "Then we don't let either decide for us." The wind outside picked up, brushing the window panes like a whisper. The old house creaked, listening. "Meet me up top tonight," he said. "At dusk." She tilted her head. "For what?" "For the kind of promise you can't file or notarize." The day passed quietly. Visitors came to see the restored light, children pressing fingers to the brass rails, teachers reading Evelyn's letter displayed behind glass. Mason guided them through the mechanical room, explaining the balance of lenses and levers. Claire stayed with the families, helping kids climb the lower steps, their laughter echoing off the stone. By evening, the crowd thinned, the sun lowering to a bruised orange edge. Mason climbed the spiral stairs first, lantern in hand, the metal steps ringing beneath his boots. Claire followed, her scarf trailing in the wind that slipped through the narrow slits of the wall. When they stepped out onto the catwalk, the world had turned copper. Below, the Atlantic breathed slow and deep. The beam turned lazily above their heads, painting the fog with soft gold arcs. Mason set the lantern down. Evelyn used to say, "Light doesn't belong to anyone." "It's just our turn to carry it." Claire smiled. "Then let's not drop it." He took a slow breath, the salt air cold in his lungs. "You said something once, about storms remembering." "I think that's true, but I think houses remember too. They remember how people treat each other inside their walls, what they say, what they break, what they fix." She folded her hands along the railing. "And what do you think this one remembers of us?" He looked out at the horizon where the sun slipped into sea, that two people showed up broken and learned how to stay standing anyway. The silence that followed was gentle, not empty, but full. When he spoke again, his voice was low, steady, carrying something more than confession. "I wrote something. For tonight." Claire's eyebrows lifted slightly. "A vow. Something like that." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small, folded page, just a torn scrap of blueprint paper, smudged at the edges. "May I?" She nodded. He read, "I don't promise forever. I promise now. I promise to listen when I'm quiet and speak when silence hurts. I promise to mend things, walls, tables, hearts with the same hands that once broke them. And if storms come again, I'll remember what you taught me, that we stand. Not because it's easy, but because it's worth it." He lowered the paper. The wind caught the corner, tugging at it like a playful child. "That's all." She looked at him for a long time, her eyes bright in the lantern's flicker. Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out something smaller, the scrap of Evelyn's old stationery she used for notes. "I wrote something too," she said quietly. "Didn't know if I'd read it." He smiled. "You don't have to." "I want to." Her voice trembled only once as she read, "I promise to keep light where it belongs, not in walls, but in people." to forgive quickly, to stay kind, even when kindness costs. And if I ever forget who I am, I promise to look at you and remember that healing doesn't always look like winning. Sometimes it just looks like staying. The paper fluttered from her hand, caught by the wind, lifted over the railing and into the sea. Neither reached to stop it. He stepped closer then, not touching her yet. The wind wrapped around them like a ribbon of cold silk. "No rings," she said softly. "No contracts," he answered. "Just this." She raised her right wrist, the same place his hand had held on the storm night months ago. He lifted his, matching her movement, wrist to wrist. The touch was quiet skin against skin, the pulse of one meeting the other, steady and real. Their breaths synced, visible in the chill. "This," she whispered, "is enough." He nodded, eyes glinting with the light from the revolving lens above them. It always was. For a moment, they simply stood there, the beam circling, the ocean murmuring far below, gulls calling through the fading light. The air smelled of salt and copper and something clean. Unburdened, Mason exhaled. "When this started, I thought love was a thing you earned. And now I think it's a thing you learn." She smiled, tears catching the last of the sun. "Then let's keep learning." The beam swept over them again, warm as breath. Somewhere below, the generator hummed like a slow heartbeat. They stayed until the first stars appeared, until the wind grew sharp enough to remind them they were human and the world was wide. When they finally turned to go inside, their wrists brushed once more an accidental echo of their vow. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence was its own language now. Below them, the lighthouse kept turning, spilling light into the dark like a quiet promise no paper could hold. Winter left quietly that year. No great melt, no roaring thaw, just a slow softening. The sea lost its iron tint. The pines exhaled their first green. The air began to smell faintly of earth again. By March, the path to hail light no longer crunched underfoot. The frost pulled back to reveal damp soil, scattered shells, and the faint prints of gulls. The house, which had groaned through every storm, now settled into something gentler, an old ship at rest after a long voyage. Inside, laughter lived where silence used to. Every Wednesday afternoon, the sound of children's feet echoed up the spiral stairs. The lighthouse reading hour had become a small legend in Seabright, the place where the view met stories, where kids carried picture books in mittened hands to read beside the light itself. Claire organized the sessions, her voice rising and falling like the tide as she read aloud. And the little boat said, "I'm not lost. I'm just finding new water." The children leaned forward, faces glowing in the warm glass circle of the lantern room. Below, in the keeper's quarters, Mason worked at his drafting table again, the same one that had once belonged to Rebecca. The tools still fit his hands. He drew the outlines of the new reading wing, a low annex that would hug the hill's curve, built from reclaimed wood and light. His pencil moved with quiet assurance, no longer the feverish scratch of a man trying to outrun his thoughts. Every so often, he paused, listening to the children's voices drifting down the stairwell, then smiled that rare, unguarded smile that had taken 6 months and a lifetime to find. A photo of Evelyn hung above the table now, framed in the same tin that had once held her letter. Below it, pinned carefully, was Claire's 3-rule list: no cruelty, no lying, eat at the same table. He still followed them, though the last one had changed its meaning. Dinner wasn't obligation anymore, it was ritual. At dusk, Claire would come down the stairs with the empty cocoa mugs and a voice hoarse from reading. She'd find him hunched over the blueprints, glasses low on his nose. He'd look up and say, 5 more minutes. And she'd answer, "I'll give you 10. Then they'd end up talking until the kettle whistled. Peace didn't announce itself. It simply arrived, like breath you forgot you'd been holding. One afternoon, when the air carried its first hint of spring, Claire drove her mother down from the care home for a visit. Margaret Whitmore was frailer now, her hands trembling, her voice softer, but her eyes were bright with curiosity. "So this is where my daughter's been hiding her happiness," she said, smiling as Mason opened the door. "It's open hiding," Mason replied. "You're welcome to audit any time." Claire laughed, steadying her mother's arm as they stepped inside. The smell of cinnamon and sawdust mingled in the hall. Margaret paused in front of the wall where photographs hung Evelyn at the dedication, local children with their first library cards, the storm night lantern glowing like a small sun. Her gaze lingered on one new picture, Claire and Mason, standing side by side on the catwalk, the beam circling behind them. The image had been taken by one of the teachers, a candid shot, their faces turned toward the horizon. "You two look like people who finally exhaled," Margaret said softly. "Maybe we did," Claire answered. They spent the afternoon upstairs. The kids arrived in waves, boots stomping, voices filling the stairwell. Margaret sat in a cushioned chair near the window, hands wrapped around a picture book of lighthouses. Mason had found it in the Boston archives and restored its faded pages. When Claire finished reading aloud, a small girl, maybe 6, with a braid too long for her head, ran down the stairs ahead of the others. She tripped at the last step, catching herself on Mason's knee. He steadied her with one hand. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, eyes wide, clutching her book like treasure. Then, without thinking, she slipped her tiny hand into his, just for balance, just for a heartbeat. Claire, still at the top of the stairs, froze at the sight. That same gesture, that same hand, that same moment that had once changed everything. Mason looked up at her, then not startled, not self-conscious, just still, the faintest trace of wonder in his face, as if some invisible circle had closed. The girl smiled, thanked him, and ran off toward the door, pigtails flying. Mason's hand lingered in the air for a second before dropping to his side. Claire walked down the last few steps, her mother's quiet humming following behind her. "Looks like you've been promoted," she said gently. He tilted his head. "To what guardian of small hearts?" He chuckled. A low sound. "It's easier work than fixing walls." "Sometimes," she said, "it's the same thing." He glanced toward the drafting table, where his latest sketch showed a small room lined with shelves and low benches, a corner labeled Children's Lighthouse Library Wing. At the bottom, in his careful hand, a new dedication line for Evelyn, for Rebecca, for the hands that keep the light steady. By late afternoon, the crowd thinned. The children's laughter faded down the hill. The house breathed again, slow, content. Claire helped her mother into a chair by the fire, while Mason refilled the kettle. Margaret flipped through the picture book, her finger tracing the illustrations. "You know," she murmured, "when your father and I built that little porch swing, he said something silly. He said, 'It's not the boards that make it hold, it's the air between them.' I think he was right. You can't see what holds a thing together. You just feel it." Claire's eyes softened. "That's exactly what this place is." Mason brought the tea, setting her cup down gently. "You raised a good builder," he said. Margaret smiled, eyes half closed. "No," she whispered, "just a good mender." The fire crackled. Outside, the last snow melted into the grass, the water shining gold in the dusk. When Margaret dozed off, Claire and Mason stood in the doorway, side by side. The light from the setting sun spilled through the window, painting the old wood honey-colored. Below them, children's footprints dotted the path, a winding trail leading from the lighthouse steps to the shore. "Think she'll sleep well tonight?" Mason asked. "She's home," Claire said. "We all are." The beam above them swept once across the horizon, catching the windows, the water, and their faces for an instant before turning away again, a pulse of gold against the gathering blue. Mason reached for Claire's hand. This time, there was no hesitation, no surprise, only the familiar, earned peace between them. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you hear that? The waves." "No," she said. "The house. It's quiet." He smiled. "Finally." And as the beam completed another slow revolution, spilling light across the calm sea, the house stood watch, not as a monument to loss, but as a home of quiet joy, still teaching anyone who entered that light, once shared, never really leaves. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments when we finally stop running from ourselves. Mason and Claire didn't fall in love because fate demanded it. They learned to love because life dared them to stay through silence, misunderstanding, and the ache of old wounds. Theirs wasn't a story of romance, it was a story of repair, of two people rebuilding not just a house, but the courage to trust again. Forgiveness doesn't always arrive with a dramatic apology. Sometimes it shows up in the way we hand someone a cup of coffee, or the way our fingers linger just a second longer than they used to. Maybe that's what the lighthouse was teaching all along, that light doesn't erase the dark, it simply lives beside it, steady and patient, until we're ready to see again. And when we do, the world feels just a little softer. Thank you for being here with us, for listening, for feeling, and for believing that stories still have the power to heal. Every like, share, and subscribe isn't just a click, it's a small act of kindness, a way of keeping light alive in a world that sometimes forgets how to look for it. Your support helps us tell more stories that touch the soul, remind us of our shared humanity, and whisper gently that it's never too late to begin again. From all of us at Shining Stories, thank you for letting your heart stay open.